I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of myself and my co-organizer and colleague, Tal Goldfajn from Spanish and Portuguese Studies, to our first conversations on translations. And I'd like to also thank all of our co-sponsors of the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, Comparative Literature Program, Spanish and Portuguese Studies, the Translation Center, Afro-Am Studies, English Department, Jewish and Near Eastern Studies, and the MFA program for poets and writers at UMass. We're really very grateful for all your support and welcome it very much. I want to remind members in the audience to write questions in the Q&A that you can write, as you're listening to the conversation, or if you have questions that you didn't write in the pre-registration, you can put them up at any point, and you can keep posting them really even when the Q&A starts, because we'll be checking in and seeing what kinds of questions are coming up in response to different things. I'd also like to introduce Rafael Freire. He's a graduate student in comparative literature and our technical assistant for the webinar. Rafael will be keeping time and will also be introducing the Q&A portion of our event, beginning with one or two of his own questions to start. Okay, so now without further ado, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Professor Marjorie Perloff as our first guest to our series, one of the foremost critics of contemporary, modern, and avant-garde poetry and poetics writing in English. Professor Perloff is currently Sadie D. Patek Professor Emerita of Humanities at Stanford University and Florence Scott Professor Emerita of English at the University of Southern California. Professor Perloff will be discussing her new book, Infrathin, an experiment in micropoetics, in which she reconsiders the nature of the poetic, examining its visual, grammatical, and sound components. Now, before I turn the conversation over to my colleague Tal, I'd like to take the opportunity to say to you, Marjorie, how very delighted we are to be sharing part of the celebration of your 90th birthday this week. And we all send you our best wishes for a wonderful, wonderful year.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Moira, and thank you, Marjorie. This is a distinct honor and also a bit intimidating. So let's start. A few years ago, in an event in São Paulo, the great Brazilian concrete poet and translator Augusto de Campos referred to you as the expert in deciphering undecipherable texts. I want to start by saying that this is an astonishingly rich book, a joy to read, and this event cannot do justice to all its richness and its magnificent auditory imagination. But I hope we can touch upon two or three central issues that pervade the book. So I will begin with a large question on the infrathin, this concept which is at the heart of the book. The infrathin, the smallest of differences, the subliminal difference, the last of lastness, which is a concept you bring from Duchamp, who actually said it was not a concept that could not be defined, that it should be a noun, that it should not be a noun, that it should only be an adjective and could only be outlined by examples, such as the warmth of a seat which has just been left, or velvet trousers, the whistling sound in walking by brushing of the two legs. So Marjorie, I think we would all like to hear about your infrathin perspective and the kind of new readings that this micropoetics perspective is opening up. And also, very importantly, how an infrathin reading can remind us, as you say, of what it is that makes poetry poetry.
Thank you for that wonderful question. I'm very glad to start with that. I have an epigraph at the beginning of Infrathin from Wittgenstein, who is the person I've been writing on a lot, and I have a book coming out, translation of the notebooks, and I want to do something next on Duchamp and Wittgenstein. Actually, they never linked, but they were exact contemporaries, and there's a lot in common. But anyway, Wittgenstein says, Hegel seems to me to be always wanting to say that things which look different are really the same. Whereas my interest is in showing that things which look the same are different. And that, I think, is exactly like the concept of the infrathin. We know very well that we also do have to make large comparisons. But in an age where, this is my argument really, following Duchamp, and I think he meant it in that sense too, in an age when we have nothing but large empty comparisons, if you turn on the TV anytime or look on Facebook, whatever, you have, the politicians making these endless comparisons. A recent one would be when everybody says, follow the science. It's such a ridiculous concept. What do you mean follow the science? What science? There's not one science, and there's not one scientific answer. So when all these people say, I'm just following the science, this is an example of sort of nonsense. But poetry, of all things, is the language, or should be the language, where language is really examined closely, and poetry is always intense and, as Ezra Pound said, language charged with meaning. And so it can be especially charged with meaning if you do make yourself aware of, as I say, these seemingly minute differences. Perhaps the best example, most serious example that Duchamp gives is if you take a mold and put things in a mold and you think they're all going to be the same, there will always be some difference, some slight difference. No two things are ever alike. And Gertrude Stein, who's one of my other idols, always has been, said that all along, that things aren't the same. When you think that you're just doing the same thing and repeating, every time you repeat a sentence, it in fact has a slightly different effect, or repeat a word because it is now surrounded by something slightly different. So once you become aware of that kind of difference, it is really very pleasurable. And the main reason really I wanted to put this book together, and some of the essays I had written slightly earlier, is that today poetry is talked about so badly. I've never seen a period, I hate to say it, but it's true, where poetry is it isn't even neglected because there's a lot of writing going on, but it's really only poets for other poets, mostly in this country. The situation, say, in Brazil is different. I'll come to that in a minute. But here we've come to the point where it's all just subject matter. Somebody wrote a poem about the election, or they wrote a poem about race, or whatever it is. It's as if it's just an instrumental vehicle. And it's also Wittgenstein who said, do not forget that although poetry is written in the language of information, it is not given in the language game of giving information. If you want information, surely there are easier ways of getting it than from poetry. And so that isn't really the main business of poetry, never has been. You can make anything a poetic subject. We're going to talk about Williams a little later, where you have tiny poems that you would think, well, what are they really about? No grand subject, but are obviously brilliant. And so I wanted to go back to kind of basics, but not the so-called new criticism, American new criticism, which certainly I admire in many ways, but it was purely thematic. And they even said it was thematic. It was always a matter of finding the central paradox of the poem, as in Cleanth Brooks writing on Donne's canonization, and so on. So the discussions were always thematic. What is this poem about? Why is it good? How does it make its case? And a great ignoring of what are, after all, the central poetic elements, which are rhythm, meter, syntax, sound structure, basically sound structure and visual structure in the beginning in the 20th century. And that's why I got so interested in concrete poetry, where you often have only one word, or you might have two words like Viva Vaya. It's a fabulous poem, really, and it's a political poem. And you can analyze it in all kinds of ways. And there are other one-word poems by Augusto de Campos that are just brilliant. And today, it's such a visual culture that we do tend to see rather than hear so much. But the great thing about both concrete poetry, which was also designed to be heard, certainly and related to music, is that you have to both see and you have to hear. And often they contradict each other. In the case of Ezra Pound, I have a whole chapter on Pound, who used so many Chinese ideograms. And the page is scattered with Chinese ideograms. He usually explains them a line or so below, so it's not very difficult. But I didn't know this till I wrote the chapter. When you listen to Pound on Pen Sound, on the wonderful website Pen Sound, there are all the readings of Pound curated by Richard Seaberth, wonderful translator. And I didn't realize before that when Pound gets to those Chinese ideograms, he just leaves them out. So when you hear it, it's obviously a very different poem from the poem that you see right? Because he's leaving the ideograms out, and I don't know quite how he would cover them in reading. Susan Howe, who's one of the, I think, great poet, maybe writing today, Susan Howe also has certain visual effects that you can't quite translate when you read them out loud, but she does it in then different ways and stresses certain things. And she's done wonderful readings, also with musical accompaniment and so on, that then have a slightly different effect. So I do think with the new poetry, especially, or maybe 20th century poetry in general, you have to both see it and hear it. And of course, look at the meaning. So there's the semantic, there's the, they are really verbi, voco, visual in being both semantic and being vocal and visual. And so the other group that influenced me a lot, and they're not as well known today as they once were, but they should be, are the Russian formalists. And I call to your attention a book that's just been published and that I just reviewed for the Los Angeles Review of Books, which is Tinyanov. I mean, Tinyanov's work, Yuri Tinyanov, was always known, but not as well known as Roman Jakobson, Boris Eichenbaum, etc. The Russian formalists writing in the teens and 20s about wonderful Russian poetry. Tinyanov was a very important figure because he studied the evolution of poetry, and he studied very much how when one genre might be very important in one century and then goes underground and comes up again later in a different form. And meanwhile, another will come up. So the example he gives, for instance, is charades. The charades in 18th century Russian poetry, which I don't really know, was evidently an important poetic genre. Today we play charades, it's just a game, right? And so the other things that were just games that become poetic and vice versa, depending on the context. So his theory is very much, which is my theory, and I would say Duchamp's theory, that context is all. You can never look at anything apart from context. And so in general, you can't really read one poem so much. You have to look at it in relation to other poems by the same poet, but also by other poets of the period, by the culture, by the history, and so on. And Tinyanov, he also studies film, gives just wonderful examples of how that works, and how there's a chapter called Poetic Evolution, but another one called Poetic Fact, where he talks about how facts are used in information and how they're used in poetry. So I think maybe I'll just stop right there for a minute and let you ask the next question.
Okay, thank you, Marjorie. Actually, you mentioned Wittgenstein, and if there is this question by Wittgenstein, which hovers over the book, like, Roch Elohim, the breath of Wittgenstein, when he asks, isn't the same, at least the same? And I want to take this precisely to our topic, to the second topic, which is translation, which is the main theme of our series. And it appears that in various forms in this book, and not only in this book, as you just said, you're actually translating Wittgenstein, right, at the moment, right? So,
Right, I have, yeah.
And you've written on Wittgenstein and translatability, but in this particular book, you start from the very translation of Duchamp's term inframance to English Infrathin, but also, for instance, when you read Gertrude Stein, Against the Grain, using, among other things, Duchamp's French translation of what Stein stanzas in meditation, it seems to me that translation is occupying a privileged space where the infrathin may be revealed almost as a tool for infrathin excavation. So I'd be very curious to hear more about the role translation may have in your infrathin perspective. How do you see translation operating with this practice of micropoetics you're proposing?
Well, that's a wonderful question. That's really great. And you develop it in a way better than I do. The Gertrude Stein that she is referring to is, and this is a perfect example of infrathin, that Duchamp, of all things, translated one of Gertrude Stein's many people say incomprehensible stanzas in meditation, written in the early 30s. John Ashbery said about it's an open field of possibilities. You can do all kinds of things with it, but it's really it is a difficult poem. But the funny thing is that because French has the masculine and feminine genre, and hers are therefore neutral, many of the things are neutral, he by translating it, very wittily changed it. It's very clear that in the one he's writing about, in a way, she thinks of herself as a man and she wants to be a man writing. But of course, nobody has said that about the English version. But then when you read it in French, where it just becomes il, you know, an L and il, well, then you realize, I mean, he's sort of tongue in cheek, poking fun at her slightly and showing what she wants to be. So of course, the French is then rather different from the English. Now, most people haven't even realized that, but therefore translation, of course, is never just a direct rendering. It's an art of its own and brings something different to it and creates, in a way, a new poem, or certainly something different. And we have to be aware of that difference. And the problem, though, is there's some poems that lend themselves very well to that, and others, I think, don't. The Goethe Wanderer's Nachtlied, Wanderer's Nachtlied, with which I start, in the opening chapter, I have yet to see a translation of that I think works, because everything there is the sound, and that's very hard to do. So it works better with certain poems than with others, with prose, even poetic prose, more than with poetry. Concrete poetry, as a matter of fact, there are good translations into French. I'm not so sure. It's very difficult in English, but there's a wonderful collection of Augusto by, my mind is a blank, the translator, I'll think of it in a minute. In French, he's very good, or in Italian, in any Romance language, the translations are very good. Into English, I have been trying to get a publisher, and maybe we can talk about that privately later, to do an English language reader of Augusto. And of course, the visual is so important, and it's expensive to produce a book. So we still don't have it. It's incredible that this very famous poet, who's won every prize in South America, that there's no good translation. There will, however, be a very good translation of Haroldo by Odile de Campos, who I think is here today, or will be here. And I did a blurb for that for Ugly Duckling Press. I think Odile did an excellent job of translating the very difficult Galaxias, I'm probably mispronouncing it, into English, and it works well, but that has a more prose basis. I have to say, when the basis is metered poetry with rhyme, it is very, very hard to get a translation. All the Dante translations we now have, some try terza rima, some try, something else. It's really very hard to give any sense in English of those poets. And that's why one of my great sorrows is how little Goethe, I mean, German is my native language, how Goethe and Heine is an incredible poet. The short poems, I just don't know of any poems that are greater, but there's no really good English translation, and people here have never heard of them. They just don't know it. As a result, Brecht is another. I was telling Tyler that there's an excellent translation of Brecht into Portuguese, into Brazilian, by André Valias, who has a complete Brecht. So at least you get the complete German if you want that too. And the translation, but of course it's into Portuguese. And so, we're often missing in American English, or rather in England too, these translations. There are a lot of translations of Celan. Paul Celan, because of the Holocaust, I've written about that elsewhere, in Edge of Irony, this sort of exaggeration of always only considering him the Holocaust poet, rather than, he's also a love poet, many other things, but the same 4 poems are always translated. It's a little better now. I find the reviews of it also often not very good, done by people who don't know German very much. Michael Wood reviewed it for the London Review of Books. Pierre Joris has collected Paul Celan. But Paul Celan is not as hard to translate as Brecht, because Paul Celan writes a free verse, and you can work with that. I don't think it's that difficult, despite the difficult words and the all the invented words and so on, and neologisms. I don't think it's so hard to translate. Whereas somebody like Brecht, who uses rhyme, the other poet is Baudelaire, whom I do talk about in Infrathin. And I give sample translations. When I teach Baudelaire, when I've taught Baudelaire, I prefer to use Rosemary, the last name's prose translation for the Penguin text, who has the French, and right below the French just gives you a straightforward prose English translation. As long as one can see the French, it's fine. And in fact, I feel that way in general. I don't believe in doing text of translations if you possibly can avoid it, and not also having the original language there to check in on. I like that even for Chinese, which I can't read at all, when you see what the poem looks like, what a stanza looks like in a Chinese poem, and then you have the English on the other side of the page. I know it's expensive to do, and then you can get it. That is always going to be more satisfactory. Or today, what we can do a lot is use the internet. For instance, with Russian poetry, you can hear Mayakovsky reading. You can hear on UbuWeb, you can hear Apollinaire reading Zone or reading Le Pont Mirabeau. Le Pont Mirabeau, and then you can read it in English or have the student look at the text of a translation and also at least hear the original, because if you hear how the original sounds, it makes a big difference. But it is hard from the point of view of being a critic to write very much about poetry in a language you don't know. I mean, I know at least a little Portuguese and I know Italian, so I can make it out. And also they are short, and so you can do it. And I've done it by using the dictionary and so on. But for instance, people say Polish poetry, there's wonderful in the Polish poetry. There've been a lot of Nobel Prize winners from Poland. It's just too hard for me. I mean, I feel I just can't really talk about that. Israeli poetry, for instance, I would like to read, but I don't know any Hebrew. And if you really don't know any, it's really hard to do. So what I recommend also in terms of translation is that if somebody takes a course, at least this helped me a lot. When I was working on the Futurist moment many years ago, I wanted to be able to do the Russian poets a little bit. I took a crash course in Russian at Irvine. It was one of those 6-week summer courses where you're supposed to live in a dorm or at least come in every day, and you could only talk Russian, which meant the first week or two we didn't talk at all because couldn't even say pass the salt or anything. But I would say I learned enough even in 6 weeks so that I know the Cyrillic alphabet. I know a little bit how the poetry sounds when I hear it. When I hear Anak Matova, I can get it and I can follow the English and so on. So that I think that would complement, working on translation in some ways rather than perhaps, well, most people, of course, translate from a language they do know well. But I'd like to just ask you a question in return, or maybe we can talk about this later. How do you feel about all the translators? This is true of Dante, who literally don't know a word of Italian.
So I think there is a question of a colleague who will ask you this.
Oh, okay.
But I thought that it was very interesting that for your 90th birthday, the poet and friend Charles Bernstein wrote a poem for you.
Yeah.
Out in the Chicago, University of Chicago blog, and it's entitled Go Figure, and it opens with translation precedes poetry. Yes. Translation precedes poetry, and so when you mentioned the translations of Baudelaire, which you compare in the book, and when you compare the various English translations of Baudelaire, I think translation is dramatizing precisely the Infrathin reading you're suggesting, and it shows how translation may have the function of criticism. And I think it's very dear to the Brazilian concrete poet and translation you've worked a lot of, and you mentioned already, was Haroldo de Campos. Although this idea he actually adopted from Pound. So I want to stay with the Campos and ask you about your long and fruitful engagement with the Campos brothers' poetic and translatorial project, because we can choose to look at translation through the losing glass and foreground everything that gets lost, but we can also turn to the sophisticated translation practice of Haroldo de Campos and Augusto, where translation is defined as transcreation. He insists that every translation of a creative text will be always a recreation. So I'd be very interested to know more about the history of your engagement with their work, their ideas, and perhaps the place that these things have in your own reflection and poetic perspective.
Well, yes, I should say they're both incredible translators. Augusto, in his old age, has now done Provençal. He's translated the Provençal poets. He's translated Gertrude Stein. He's translated Marion Moore. I mean, if he were nothing else, his translations alone are brilliant. And that's what he now spends his time doing. And they are, as far as I can tell, really, on the one hand, remarkable and just bring a whole new discourse in. Haroldo was a great theorist of translation, among other things, the whole idea of transcreation. And well, there are various things to be said about that. First of all, I think it is not a surprise that it happened in what Deleuze would call a minor literature. In other words, when living in Brazil, coming of at the time of after World War II, getting people to know your work in other countries and getting to be part of the discourse, translation was, of course, especially necessary. Haroldo has translated everything from Homer to, you know, all the classics to modern things, and is really, as I say, an exemplary theorist of how translation works and how, of course, it creates a different poetry. But I have a slight, I mean, I would say as a generalization, they could do it because they're brilliant poets, you know, and maybe you do have to be a poet to really do that well, because I've seen other people, you know, sometimes make the same attempt and it doesn't really work very well. It all, you know, like anything else, you have to be good at it. And people who have a poetic sense can do it, whereas maybe the average scholar or something like that, you know, they don't work as well. Now and don't forget, they do it because they're bringing poets into Brazil who the Brazilians didn't know, like Marion Moore, probably, or all these poets. Now, what about the reverse? What are we doing? What are you? And I hope you're doing for their poetry. As I say, there's this great translation of Galaxias, but with Augusto, it's still very lacking, or often the poems are left in Portuguese since they're very short with notes then to explain, you know, how they work, whether in French, Italian, in the other languages. But I don't know what the solution is to putting some of these things in English. We really need them because honestly, you know, you and I agree that these are great poets, but when I mention them to most people, they've never heard of them. They've never heard of them. And that is so amazing because we had a big event for Augusto, and Haroldo came into it too. It's just that now he's dead. Augusto in Hungary, of all places, a number of years ago. And Nico Bolobas, there's something called the Pannonius Prize. And I'm on the committee, and I worked it so that Augusto won. And so he came. First, he said he didn't travel, but then he came with his family and everything. And he gave absolutely marvelous readings of, for instance, what is my favorite that I've written about recently, one of my favorites, Moby Dick. Moby Dick. It's absolutely brilliant. It has a performance part. That's the other point. Augusto has grown so that he has included performance, of course, sound, and he performs with his son Sid, so there's musical accompaniment. And Moby Dick is a concrete poem that just uses those letters, and then the letters of his poem for it going across the page like a square. That's the beginning. But then the square becomes the subject of larger materials, the whiteness of white, the blackness of black, Malevich, Rodchenko, his own poem. And actually, that's, even if you don't know Portuguese, you can read most of that poem and translate it with the help of a dictionary. Anyway, I didn't realize till I worked on it what a wonderful commentary it is on Moby Dick itself and on the whiteness of the whale and what is whiteness. So you have on the one hand, Augusto's translation of Moby Dick, transcreation of Moby Dick, then the transcreation of the performance of the poem, and then the addition of music to the poem. So it becomes a multi-layered work, very appropriate for our own day. There are many versions of it, and they're on YouTube. You can see them easily on YouTube. And so, by the way, now that we have YouTube, all this is so much easier. When I first used to teach these poets, you had to go to the rare book room of the library with white gloves on, you know, if you had a rare book room at your university or a good place to go, and send the students to the rare book room to read the books. Now, it isn't quite the same as having the book in your hands, and I have quite a good collection, but you can do it all on screen, and you can do it with YouTube so that we have all this available. So it should be a great age really for translation. And it is a great age for translation. But the reason what Charles means in that poem, I think partly, it's a little obscure, is he and I think he's listening today, maybe I'll ask a question, that he and I have had many fights about translation. He'll translate something and I'll say, that's too arbitrary. It just doesn't capture the original, or I don't think it should be done that way, or it can never be as good. And he'll argue the translation precedes, but that of course translation is very, very important. And by the way, his poems have been translated beautifully into German by an Austrian little collective. In Vienna, there's a group, a translation group, and they were doing Rosemary Waldrop when I was last there, and they go over every line and really discuss, how did you do it? How would you do that line? And so on, so that's all going on. But so Charles and I have that very friendly debate about, well, can you really translate? Or I will sometimes be curmudgeonly and the devil's advocate and say, no, I don't think when it comes to Goethe, Heine, these poets, or Baudelaire, I've never seen a translation of Baudelaire I thought was adequate. Keith Waldrop is a poet and is quite good, but it comes across as quite prosaic. I shouldn't say that. I'll take that back. There's a new translation, which I did by Nathan Brown in Canada. Nathan Brown, it's just out. From a small, I can't remember the name, but it's on Facebook right now. And Nathan is really quite bilingual, being Canadian. And it isn't what he usually works on. He's a theorist. So he's worked mostly on very new poetry and on theory, but he just decided he wanted to do Baudelaire because he loved it. And so he did the whole Fleur de Mal. I think and he does use rhyme, quite a bit of rhyme, or tries. I think that's a quite good one of the best I've seen, but it is almost impossible to get the real flavor of why Baudelaire is so great. The prose poems, yes, which Walter Benjamin talks about a lot, so you can do the prose poems, but the lyrics are really hard to do. And I think that's true of Mallarmé to some extent. It's true in general of the great 19th century, more lyric poets. It would be true of Yeats. I do have a chapter on Yeats in my book, but I don't think Yeats translates well. And by the way, T.S. Eliot, I've seen French translations, for instance, of Eliot that I don't think capture the original. I'll give you an example. There's the great poet Gorantian. Here I am, an old man in a dry month, being read to by a boy waiting for rain. I was neither at the hot gates nor fought. It's about them really not fighting in war. And then there's a line that goes, nor knee deep in the mud, holding a cutlass bitten by flies, fought, where the last line of a long line and the last word is fought, and with all the emphasis on fought, wielding a cutlass bitten by flies, fought. Now, in French, when you translate that and you try to get a key word like that at the end of the line, it's very hard to do because it's not going to have the sound of fought, which is very dramatic sounding. So you have to do it a different way. I'm not saying you can't do it at all, but it's going to stress other strengths. So that, of course, is a great thing about translation. There was a great translator who died recently from Finland. And when you live in a country like Finland, you have to translate, that's Levi Leto. Levi Leto, who a little bit like Haroldo, could translate anything. He translated Ulysses, Joyce's Ulysses. He translated Charles Bernstein. He did, and his argument was, you don't even try to translate directly. You do an equivalent. You create an equivalent that may have different metaphors, different images, that really not the same because you can't do it, and just create an equivalent. And that, of course, is very hard. And it's really brilliant, when you can do it. And I think that's a good idea, to do that. That could be a very good idea and something to get students maybe to do or whatever, to do an equivalent rather than to try to go line by line and translate exactly. So I would say this, just in conclusion to that, it all depends what the translation is for. If you want a translation because you're having a course on Goethe and you want to see what it's like, and it's for learning about Goethe, then an equivalence is not going to be maybe quite adequate. If instead you are reading poetry for the pleasure of poetry or being very interested in poetry, then it might be very successful. So the real question is, what is the translation for, and what is it going to be used for, and how, again, the context would be crucial, I think, in what context it was going to be received. Now, for instance, right now we have all these translations of Pessoa, and there's a new biography that has come out of Pessoa. Well, I did read the biography and I've tried to read Pessoa, but I feel I'm missing something, at least in any of the translations I've seen. I don't know. But in translation, it doesn't seem that remarkable to me as poetry. I know there are all the heteronyms and all that. And so I'm waiting maybe for the right translation or somebody to take me into it. But without knowing Portuguese, that I have a hard time with, and yet I take the word of people who say he's such a key poet. You see what I mean? So it all depends what it's for, what the context is, what else you know, and so on. Does that answer at all?
Yes, yes, yes. There are many questions that I hope we can get at the end, but and also, I mean, you mentioned Haroldo de Campos and his translation project, and if we have time, I'll tell you what it is that he translated, from biblical Hebrew, the Genesis, and what a revelation it was to find that text. But since we don't have much time, I just want to mention that there is one thing that was very clear there, which was the question of linguistic memory. What was there in the biblical Hebrew, the linguistic memory there, and in the Portuguese, because I think this is one of the things that actually you developed as one of the purposes of the chapters when you work on the question of precursors and heirs. So when you're writing about Eliot, for instance, you suggest that he should be considered a precursor of concrete poetry. When you write about Pound's afterlife, you conclude that it was in the work of these Brazilian Greek poets that Pound's legacy was carried to its logical conclusion. Yeah. Hot Heb Hebrew to Fala Prata and Luxo Lixo, many of the chapters of the book engage in revisionist history, placing the poet and their work in new contexts and suggesting unexplained alignments. So can you tell us more about the importance of this remapping of tradition and inheritance in your work?
Absolutely. I mean, I knew I was sort of, going to make a lot of people mad by saying that Eliot was the precursor of concrete poetry, but Eliot is always considered the precursor of Arden, and then these very traditional American poets. And what struck me was that Ian Hamilton Finley, for instance, who surely knew his Eliot, the others did, that he basically did get the idea from Eliot in a way that every word counts, and that what you do with every word is important, and that's what poetry really is, and visual, and he heightened the visual, of course. And so it really is just like part of the same. But I also have questions about Eliot. I just wrote a piece on the Wasteland, because, in 22 is the centennial of the Wasteland, so there's a lot being written. And this essay is rather different. I asked myself about the foreign language tags. Everything is an allusion to a foreign language, and some of them are in the original language, but most are not. Unlike Pound, he'll translate. So I had not thought death had undone so many from Dante, but it's translated. But then on the other hand, he'll leave it in Italian when it's pois cascosa nel fuoco che li affina, and he leaves that in Italian. Now, why does he sometimes translate? Why not? And that's a very interesting thing to study, because of course the poem ends with Sanskrit, which I've always thought was a little pretentious. I mean, Eliot had studied some Sanskrit, but you get Ganga was sunken, which I guess sounds more dramatic than the Ganges was sunken, and then you get Dayata and Shanti. Well, this is what I asked, and I asked an Oxford professor this. The Hebrew prophets, however, are of course always represented in the King James Bible, as if that's where they come from. So you have Italian, Greek, Latin, German, French, Sanskrit, right, in the original. But when it comes to the Hebrew prophets, there's the whole section at the beginning, Son of Man, from Isaiah, from Ezekiel, and also from Ecclesiastes. And of course, they're all in English. And so I asked this religion professor at Oxford, why are these all in English? He said, but it's the King James Bible. I said, well, I realize it's from the King James Bible, but people are beginning to ask the question now, why or every other language? You see, this is where the whole thing becomes cultural and political too, but why no Hebrew? Well, we all know the answer to that really is that although they taught Hebrew at Harvard, as they taught Sanskrit, the poets were not going to do anything with Hebrew. It's a little bit anti-Semitic. And I mean, at Oxford or Cambridge, they wouldn't have dreamt of putting Hebrew in, or the allusions to Hebrew, right, as they do to these other languages. And it's really interesting to think why. And so I went back and read Robert Alter's book
Mhm.
on the art of translation in the Bible. And Alter makes the point that there are wonderful, complicated puns and metaphors, of course, in the prophets, and of course in the Song of Solomon and so on. And that, of course, those could be talked about in the same way that people talk about, Eliot, but nobody ever raised that question. So here's another interesting facet of translation. Why translate and why not translate at all? And what does that mean politically and so on? I mean, Greek and Latin were, of course, the great languages studied, at Oxford, Cambridge, in the United States too, at Harvard and whatever. So it was okay to put in Greek and Latin and French, especially those three. Not much Spanish in those days, again, because that wouldn't have been, things. So now Augusto and Geraldo, to turn it around, they're like citizens of the world in a way. I mean, Geraldo was an incredible linguist. He really knew the languages, and they did love Pound for that reason. And it is one of the great things about Pound, because of course he really knows the foreign languages he uses. But I mean, it's always interesting to see what a poet doesn't use. Pound has very little about German, anything, because he didn't really know German, very little. He certainly didn't know Russian. So there never there could have been references, let's say, to the modern Russian poets who are so great, but there aren't any, and but nobody knows everything, so it is interesting sometimes to look at what's left out and what isn't used. And I would say Geraldo and Augusto are unique almost in this reach, in this real reach. I mean, one of my first favorite Augusto things was Cage, Chance, Change, where he took John Cage and wrote this wonderful, essays about him coming off of that and translating. So that's a wonderful thing. And I got interested in it purely by fluke, also partly an answer to your question, and then I'll stop, in that I was invited to Brazil because the Futurist Moment came out, which had a chapter on concrete poetry. And so I was invited to Brazil. And so I just sort of fell in love with Brazil. I've been 5 times, I think. And always more fascinated by, first of all, their love of poetry and the great interest in poetry. And that's true I've been in Chile fairly recently, 2 years ago. It was very true there. I was amazed at how much they knew about poetry and how well they knew it. I've never been to Argentina, where I would love to go, but of course I've been to Spain and I've been to Portugal. And there's a woman in Portugal named Gracia Capinha, who's at the University of Coimbra, who had some great poetry conferences about 10 years ago or more. I mean, she can't have them anymore. There's no money for it, I think, but they were wonderful. Poets would read in different venues at church, outdoors, wherever, in front of the bishop's palace, and from different countries. And that was a wonderful experience. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Marjorie, so I would love to continue talking, about biblical translations and Alter's perspective and everything, but I know Moira has her questions, so I just pass.
Yeah, we could go on and on. Yeah.
Please, Moira.
Moira, you're on mute.
I can't hear. Her microphone is not, yeah.
Yes, no, yeah.
Yes.
Yes, I wanted to shift gears a little bit from the interlingual to the intersemiotic, because I've been very interested in your writing about the relationship between poetry and painting and poets and painters. And I wondered if you could talk about the cross-pollination between visual art or visual artists and poets, particularly in the mid 20th century, which you write about, your study of Frank O'Hara, for example, and particularly the chapter Poet Among Painters. I really found I found there's so much in that. I wanted to hear you say something more about that relationship. And one of the things that I was struck by when I was reading that chapter in particular was there's a lot of terminology that kind of comes out throughout it that is clearly related to translation. So words like correspondence or imitation or equivalence, or indeed the word translation you use at some point. And then this, you talk about in places, with when he's entering the world of his friend Grace's canvas through her figures, or other artists are impinging upon and entering his poetry. These are all actions that we think about when we consider the process of translation. So my question is, where this did occur in that period, and it did, of course, what were its consequences, do you think? And are they still evident? And
Great.
can you relate this to the Infrathin in some way?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we're going to do a lot more with it, actually. Well, I think it goes all the way up to conceptual art. We'll come back to that a little later. And the relation of conceptual art to, can there be a conceptual poetry? There are whole books on it, but I'm not so sure. But what happened in the 20th, in the earlier mid-century, I think, is that a poet like Frank O'Hara, let's go back to Williams for a minute. A poet like Williams, you can study the thing, he couldn't learn much from poetry. In other words, he starts out trying to write like Keats a little bit and imitating things, and it wasn't going anywhere. And then he saw the Cubist shows, and he met Duchamp, and he realized that what really was the dominant art in that period, in a way. See, it always depends what the dominant is. Sometimes it might be music in the late 19th century, where the symbolists were so influenced by music. Sometimes it might be architecture, but in the mid-century, the painters were way ahead of the poets. So when you had Jackson Pollock, and Frank O'Hara was a curator by fluke, he started out working in the gift shop, and worked his way up to being a curator. You couldn't do that too easily today. He had no advanced degrees or anything of the sort, never had studied art, but he saw the Jackson Pollocks, and he has that wonderful poem called Number 1, 1948, where he does a kind of verbal, it's not really an equivalent to get to the understanding. The words are tricky. It never can really be an equivalent, of course, in words, but he tries to capture the mood of that particular poem, of that particular painting. And it's when art was way ahead of poetry, because poetry was still very traditional, and people like Richard Wilbur and even Robert Lowell were writing perfectly traditional elegies, odes, modernized a little bit, but they were. And he was so dissatisfied with that you have to look elsewhere. And art painting gave him really the avenue in. And there's the wonderful poem, Why I'm Not a Painter, which is just silly because it doesn't resolve into anything. Why am I not a painter? Well, there's really no good reason, but I'm not. And words are different. Well, in many ways, they're the same. So it depends on the period. So in that period, Frank O'Hara, in the chapter in Poem Among Painters, all his friends were painters. There's a review today in the New York Times, I think, of the Joan Mitchell show. Joan Mitchell was one of his great friends, a painter who was not so admired at the times, abstract paintings, but he always admired her, and they worked closely together. And I did get to know Grace Hardigan a little bit. But the interesting thing is this. There is no real parallel between Frank O'Hara and the first generation of abstract expressionists, who in a way he wrote about, but who are not really like him. And the painters who are more like him were painters who are considered second generation and also maybe slightly second class, like Larry Rivers, are not so highly regarded. So, it doesn't work a neat equivalence between great painter, great poet. It's where you can find something you can use. So again, Larry Rivers just gave him a lot of things to use. The most important one, though, and I have written on this, and I doubt you've seen this essay, it was in Modernism, Modernity, but I never reprinted it for the simple reason that copyright is so hard to get. For contemporary, an artist like Jasper Johns, it would have cost me a fortune. So I just I left it. But anyway, it was about the relation of Jasper Johns to O'Hara. And here we're having the big Jasper Johns shows now, known as Jap by Frank O'Hara. And he comes up in many poems, but and there's an O'Hara, there's a Jasper Johns painting, a poem with painting with O'Hara poem, where there is an actual poem on the side. And you can read it, and because the feeling was very mutual. But it wasn't until I really studied Jasper Johns poems like Liar and According to What in the early 60s that they really relate closely to the technique O'Hara used, which isn't so much collage as a kind of fragmentation, where fragments that break off, and some of it is very realistic and some of it is surrealist, and so on. It works in different ways. And it's very much the way Jasper Johns put together his paintings. And Jasper Johns has a huge painting, I think it's at the Museum of Modern Art, called In Memory of My Feelings. And there was a poem titled by O'Hara called In Memory of My Feelings. And it is wonderful to see the conjunction between the two. At the same time, O'Hara never thought he was as good as Jasper Johns, and he probably wasn't quite in a certain way, you know. And there's Jasper Johns. There's a slight feeling of jealousy. Things are never completely equal. And there's a feeling that, and he has one very sad poem late in his life where he expresses that view that I can't quite do what Jap does. He does these things with the paintbrush and strokes and so forth. So you have this conjunction between painting and poetry, and you had it early in the century too. So what happens though, and what about today? It really has sort of fizzed out for this reason. Once there was conceptual art, which meant that you might just have one line by Baldassare or whatever, at the bottom of the poem. And there was no more, it wasn't so visual anymore. It was meant not to be visual, but to take off from Duchamp and be more, by the way, I have my little, somebody brought me this, the bicycle wheel, Duchamp's bicycle wheel. This was made in Japan, which is so funny that it was made in Japan. Anyway, conceptual art comes straight out of Duchamp, and it's meant to be no longer retinal, as Duchamp would have said, or visual. Well, what happens to poetry in response to that? Now, Craig Dworkin, who's a great friend of mine, brilliant, wonderful poet, I think, and Kenneth Goldsmith, the two of them did an anthology, I don't know if you know it, of conceptual poetry based on conceptual art. And the introduction is very interesting. But what is really the parallel? I said to Craig at the time, if conceptual art is art that no longer relies on the visual, but relies on language in large part, well, then is conceptual poetry going to be poetry that no longer relies on language, but relies on the visual? And if so, and of course it never was that, what it would be appropriative. It would take off from the conceptual art's use of appropriation, so that everything is appropriation from something else, which is something Jasper Johns did a lot too, and earlier painters had already done. But the poetry of appropriation, in a way, isn't really quite like conceptual art, and it's had a lot of flack against it, and that movement in a certain way is already almost over. People talk about post-conceptual poetry. I'm not quite sure what that's really supposed to be. So the interesting thing was that as rich as the conjunction was from, I would say, the Cubists and Futurists, Futurism, where Marinetti made these, the things that Marinetti made, the wonderful poem paintings really, are really more visual than they are verbal, or at least the visual is what's really remarkable. So from the Futurist and Cubist period on down to, let's say, the 70s, you have that very important conjunction with the visual arts. I'm not sure you have it today. There are plenty of people working together with visual artists, but I haven't seen anything I think is terribly interesting, really, in that regard, or that is intersemiotic in the way you mean, in really using the other art form, in an important way. I mean, I may be missing something or skipping something. Instead, though, let me just continue with that. The great artist of that period, I think, was Robert Smithson, and the Spiral Jetty, and there's so much wonderful written on that, and has influenced a lot of works, like Craig Dworkin's most recent book called Heliography, where he is talking about visual things, but the verbal is so strong that it's like prose poetry, and you have to do the two together. And Smithson is just amazing that way, but that's already by now, he was killed in the accident. That's not new anymore. So as far as in recent work in the United States, sure, there are a lot of people who do ekphrases, if you will, of different artists, but ekphrasis is a tricky form. You have to be, to make it really interesting, again, it would have to be a transcreation rather than a translation, or pretty much, or just describing what goes on in the painting. And they're not very strong. On the other hand, for instance, Cole Swenson has done things on gardens, and she's done things on particular paintings where she does translate it. I don't know if you know her work, into something else. And some are called walking, where they will be walking, or hands. She did a book on hands where she has visual representations of hands, and then all kinds of discourse about the hand. And that's quite, that works still pretty much that way, I think.
Yeah, so context is all, as you say. I
Yeah.
think, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
and the culture is all, and it's interesting how that has changed, not necessarily for the better.
Yeah.
I say poetry, because of identity politics, poetry now is in such a phase where the most important thing is who wrote it. You know, well, when you get into the who wrote it mode, you know, what are you gonna, you know, there's not much you can really say about it. And it's such a kind of peculiar period. It'll change again, but I'm not sure how or how it will relate to the arts. And it's interesting, I've seen interesting things on architecture and poetry where there are all kinds of relations, how something is structured and created. And out of structuralism came some interesting studies of that sort, or again, studies of relationships. But I think where you're at, I mean, you can't study poetry independently of the other arts, I think today, because, you know, it's not. And one of the things that's my pet peeve is all the, I shouldn't say it, are all the seminars and societies of the lyric. I don't know what that means. All poetry today is lyric poetry. It certainly isn't narrative poetry. It's not dramatic poetry, then it would be theater, you know. So of course it's lyric. I mean, in a way, the lyric, and they end this discussions of what is the lyric. And when you do that, I always think, even Jonathan Culler's book, it's a retro mode, very retro, because in discussing the lyric of even the 20th century, I don't think he mentions The Wasteland. Well, it's only the great poem of the century in English, probably. Considered that it's a collage. It's not a lyric, and it is a collage and has complete collage methods that derive, again, very much from the art world, of course. What is collage? It came first in art. And so when you confine yourself to the lyric and who is the lyric speaker and so on, it really doesn't get you very far, because poetry today is meant to be seen and it is related closely to the other arts. You know, there are all kinds of relationships that way. And I don't think you can just, the lyric is, to me, I have the section of the first chapter called language, not lyric. And I'll stick to that I think the important thing in poetry is language is the defining factor. And therefore the parallel in the arts would be, again, the specific, you know, medium, material, and so forth, and that you can't. And so talking about the lyric is a way of taking poetry away from the other arts and making it in the tradition of the the earliest centuries, say in English, and how does it relate to those poetries? And so that's a very different exercise, and one that doesn't particularly interest me.
So Marjorie, actually, we do have a few questions on that. And in fact, Raphael has a question that relates to that. So maybe Raphael, you can take the lead and open.
So I wanted to be aware of time because we only have two minutes to the hour.
No, we can extend a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. So, well, I just want to acknowledge that we have been getting questions in the Q&A, and we have gotten some questions in advance too. So I want to apologize if we don't get through those today. We got some questions, a question from Andre Valias, another one from Odile Cisneros. I will compile those and send them to Marjorie in a future day. But Marjorie, changing the media, my question to you in general terms is if you have considered translation as it applies to song lyrics within modernism, and if I can give a little bit of context to this question to the attendees. Brazil has a strong popular song tradition, a tradition that has been present during critical moments of cultural upheaval and that has historically dialogued with the country's literary avant-gardes. Obviously, Marjorie, you're aware of the interactions between Augusto de Campos and Caetano Veloso. I've worked on translating some of Veloso's song lyrics, and I had the benefit of usually being able to gauge the rhythmical success of my translations by singing them over the song's melody. Does that mean that melody in song has a different meaning from the one it has in poetry? It might seem that the answer is obvious. It would be yes, but an understanding of Micropoetics complicates the clear separation between music as the art of sound belonging to the discipline music, and melopeia, the music of poetry, understanding poeticity precisely as the poetic realizations of speech as a sonic art form. So
that's a
going
great,
back to their...
That's just a great question. And I love Caetano Veloso's, and I do know a lot of the lyrics. I've looked at them closely, and that relationship to concrete poetry. And of course, he has done some of Haroldo. There's the wonderful Circulado, that one, Circulado, wonderful. His version of that, I just love it. I think it's great. And then well, many of the others that he has said. What is the one that where he
Pusa.
no
Pusa.
that Caetano sort of sang and added just it's almost like a tone poem. Oh,
Pusa.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Pusa.
Yeah. But the bigger question, of course, then the relation of, I mean, the lyrics, but the relation of melody to sound, I mean, the difference between music and poetry. My problem there is I am so ignorant in music. My daughter, who's bringing out a collection of concrete poetry, Nancy, who is a musicologist, a trained musicologist, she can do those things that I just can't do. And sometimes I tried to, even on Moby Dick, to get her help in how did Sid's music, let's say, work with that. But of course, that raises all kinds of other questions. It's true that in Brazil, popular song has had a lot to do with poetry. In English, the most interesting to me, but I don't remember, would be Cole Porter. The lyrics of Cole Porter, which are just incredible, and they're really terrific poems in a way, where rhyme plays a major part. I don't know if you know those, Raphael. You know, you've got that thing, you know, those songs are birds do it, bees do it, da, 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 trees do it, and, you know, wonderful. And they are important poems in their own right. But how do they relate to the music? This is what I'd be very frank, just can't really do because I don't have the training. I mean, I don't really know enough about music. You can do it. I hope you will do it to answer the question even properly, because I know, yeah, with Caetano, I can to some extent, I can with certain people, but I can't, you know, often something will say this is based on this and this rock lyric or this and that I just have a hard time talking about, but I think it needs to be talked about. It's just that, as I say, I can't really do it well.
Fabulous.
But I hope you will do it. And song lyrics are important. Robert von Halberg is bringing out a book on the importance of song lyrics. He's written a lot of good things on poetry, like Frank Sinatra, and those lyrics. And these, I mean, I know all the songs, and they work very well, but I don't really know the relationship. I do know, this is funny. I'll tell you one funny anecdote. In my chapter on John Ashbery, there was a line about the cakes. Well, I could find it even. The cake is melting in the park, and I'm picking it up, and so forth. And I just thought it was a sort of silly, you know, purposely silly thing. And my proofreader pointed out, he put in the margins MacArthur Park. It's just MacArthur Park. He's citing MacArthur Park. Well, I didn't know MacArthur Park. I'm sorry. I'm of an earlier generation. I know earlier something, but I said to all my friends, oh, he pointed out, and I added a footnote that it's from MacArthur Park. And I looked at MacArthur Park, and of course, that's where it's from. That's where John Ashbery, even older than I, and that took it, but I wouldn't have recognized it because I don't know it. So, you know, we all have holes in our whatever, or our training, and that's just one of mine. One of many, I suppose.
Marjorie, there's a question on your more than 250 book reviews over 50 years. Yes. And so how do you perceive the genre and the role? And what do you see as as your task as a reviewer? And also, when you look back over your reviews, what are some of the thoughts you have on your views along the decades?
Yeah, very interesting. For me, the review was something where I could deal with something that I couldn't deal really in a scholarly essay because I didn't know enough. So I have a lot of reviews of translation. In American Poetry Review, I did an omnibus one on various German translations and French translations. Heine, there was the Hal Draper Heine. There was Mallarmé by, I can't remember, but one by Paul Auster. And so, you know, in reviews, you dare do things you don't always dare do in so-called scholarly articles because they're shorter and all that. And I love to write about translation. I've written quite a bit. When I look back at that book, a lot of the essays are on translation. I reviewed Richard Siebert's Hölderlin translation. And I love doing that. I would actually, and I reviewed Ceylon translations, not always favorably, I might say. I'm often quite critical when it comes to those. Again, you can only do it with languages that you know, at least some, otherwise you can't. But it gives me a chance. I've written on Mayakovsky, I've written on Akhmatova, I wrote a fairly long piece in Parnassus on Anna Akhmatova that I wouldn't dare write, you know, for a scholarly journal probably, but I worked very hard on it, and have my views changed. Yes, in the sense that there were certain people who I liked then, who I like less now. But to look at the early reviews, most of them are assignments. By the way, what people don't often understand is you don't just do reviews, you do them when you're assigned something. And I used to get assigned things by the Washington Post. They would say, do you want to review could be somebody fairly, Mona Van Duyn, a poet who's barely known today. I reviewed her, and Erica Jong, and I got in a lot of trouble for the Erica Jong review. This had nothing to do with translation. Her poetry, which is really just bad. I don't think people read it anymore, but some of the feminist critics were very angry because I ended the review people saying, as far as poetry goes, in another 10 years, people will say Erica who, you know, and I do feel that turned out to be right on that. But the ones I like a little, there are also poets that I have gotten to like less in some ways than I did to begin with. One would be, Robert Lowell, whom I wrote a whole book on. Even then I was critical. And there's a whole chapter in there on his adaptations, imitations. He called transcreations imitations. And boy, are they imitations, you know, and they're of everybody. Russian poets, mostly French poets, Baudelaire, German poets. They're just really, I mean, not very good. He has these rhymes that screech out at you that I don't think do much for the poem. So there are certainly poets that I got to like less, but on the whole, I hate to say it because maybe it's then, you know, makes me not advanced enough. On the whole, I would stick to most of my views. I was always critical of Charles Olson. Some of the early reviews I wrote were of Olson. I still don't admire him. I think I was right. I don't think he's so great. I mean, all this fuss was made about his ideas, and maybe he was a man's poet. I never really could get into Charles Olson. And so there are a number of reviews that I would now not write the same way. Now, I was shocked when I reread some of the omnibus reviews. This doesn't go on anymore, but it used to happen that journals like Contemporary Literature, if you wanted to do an omnibus review, they would send you 120 books in the mail. 120, everything that came out. They're little books, and you could just pick whatever you wanted and write about it. You obviously couldn't cover them all, and you should have a theme. That's why I discovered Frank O'Hara. That was when they sent me the anthology of New York poets, and I had never read Frank O'Hara, certainly not in graduate school. And I was just really taken with it. Not so much the other poets in the anthology, except for maybe John Ashbery, James Schuyler. Anyway, when you did these anthologies, you know, do things, and I look back on some of my views there, and in that particular review, I was very negative. This takes us back to concrete poetry, to Aram Saroyan and Clark Coolidge. Aram Saroyan wrote the poem Crickets, Crickets, Crickets. It's just crickets down the page. And I said, and this was, in all fairness, this was in 1975 or so, I said, what is this? You know, I mean, this is really a poem and it's really nothing. And I didn't care for that kind of work at all. And then later I discovered Clark Coolidge, especially, as a really complex poet and interesting. And I couldn't believe I had written that. So when I reread it and it was already in proof, I thought, oh God, I should really take this out. This makes me sound sort of like a fool, but it was too late. I couldn't really do them. The same with Aram Saroyan, who also does, you know, interesting things. They're not quite like concrete poets, but they are in that vein. And it took me, I guess, a while to understand that. And here again, context in culture is very important, because concrete poetry never had an audience in this country until very recently. And in fact, when you mention it to people, they say, oh, that belongs in the craft department, really. And I once did a review of the Santa Barbara program. You know, you have those reviews, and it was a review of their, I think it's called the Critical College. It's their sort of, you know, like an honors college almost, right? And they had courses. They did have a course on book art, creating book art and artist books and so forth, taught by Harry Reese. And he told me himself, he said he couldn't teach in the main university because it was considered just a craft, that it wasn't to be taken seriously. I have, as recently as 5 years ago, I've had many friends, sophisticated friends, say, well, come on, concrete poetry. I mean, that's just fun and games, you know. And it's said in a book by Liz Coates on fluxus of all things. She has a book called Words to Make, Pages to Make, well, whatever. It's about language and poetry. And many parts of it are very interesting. And her main subject are the fluxus poets. Well, I think I can't compare myself to the best concrete poets around the world. And she has a nasty little paragraph where she says, concrete poetry was just decorative. Okay, it was just decorative. And it also had no good politics. It had no real politics, whereas Fluxus was a political movement. Well, I have just seen the most recent Fluxus show at the Getty. There's one on right now. Duchamp and Fluxus, in fact. And I went with a friend who immediately said, all it shows is how good Duchamp was, and they didn't do anything that he hadn't done. You know, the boxes and all the little things. It's true that it now seems already a little bit dated, whereas concrete poetry is just coming into its own. But I know even when Nancy had her show on concrete poetry, many people just come away and they never had heard of it. And the name is maybe unfortunate. It makes people think of concrete as in concrete, the stone, you know, which is okay some ways. What is concrete poetry? And they still don't know what it is. And they think it's not really serious. It's not like studying serious poetry. You know, we study real poetry, serious poetry and ideas. And what do you mean concrete poetry? Anybody can do that. And of course, to that, you can always answer, give the great John Cage answer. Of course they could, but they don't. Of course they could, but they don't. And in fact, of course, they couldn't really. And I think we're beginning to recognize it now, but it's just been very hard in Anglo countries. Now, why is that? Why is it so difficult in the Anglo countries? In England, same thing. I mean, in England, they had various concrete poets, but again, they were looked down on by, at Oxford, Cambridge, they looked down and it's just nothing, you know, and it's still true. And they're not real poets, you know, it's just sort of fun and games, playing around, playful. And I'm not so sure why that's true, because it wasn't true in Germany. It wasn't true in Italy. It certainly wasn't true in Brazil, you know, where it was respected as a real art form. So I think it has to do with earlier poetry in all those countries, that when you read the wonderful, the Susan Andrade about the skyscraper, what is it called? What is the poem called? Tell, you know,
Susan Andrade.
Yeah, the Wall Street, the something Wall Street. Anyway, which already looks ahead to concrete poetry and was written in 1888 or so. So it depends very much on the context. I think the answer is that in England and America, in Anglo-America, the tradition dies very hard. The Romantics were the great tradition, the great Romantic poets, from Wordsworth, etc. And that's a very different poetry. And the critics in the universities, from Harold Bloom to Helen Wendler, all these major figures had contempt for concrete poetry. And I have one quote, and I think it's in my book, In the Edge of Irony, where Elizabeth Bishop, who was living in Brazil, writes to Robert Lowell, and she said, oh, they're doing this thing down here called concrete poetry. And I went to an exhibition of it, but it's just really silly, like children's games. Now, that was written in the 60s, or even maybe the early 70s. I was shocked. I was kind of shocked, or the early 70s, but that's how it was regarded in the Anglo world. So that mood is very hard to change, and it's changing now, but it's changing because of the art world, because the art world, again, to come back to Moira's question, the art world has brought it in as a serious thing, much more than the so-called literary world. And so that's just an interesting thing. And as I say, it's because concrete poetry originally came out of countries like Brazil, Switzerland, Norway. By the way, there's wonderful Scandinavian concrete poetry, and they're wonderful critics. Now, because Irvin Fahlström was in Sweden, Jesper Olsson, who's one of the very good critics, has a magazine, or had it, doesn't exist anymore, OEI, in Sweden. It was mostly concrete poetry, and he always was very receptive to it. Tanya Arum, a critic named Tanya Arum, she's done a lot with concrete poetry. And so there's some reason why in Scandinavia, maybe it's newer countries. Do you think? I don't know what it is, but often the tradition dies very hard. And the poetic tradition didn't want to make much room for visual poetry, visual effects. Susan Howe used to get bawled out for it. Well, it isn't really quite poetry, you know, etc. So I guess the tradition dies very hard. And the tradition was a lyric tradition, you see? And then came the prose poem in a way, but again, it's not really as important, I think. I think concrete poetry is, I don't have an, it's not an Infrathin, that isn't particularly about that, but I do think it's the world, it's the poetry of the future. And there are also younger people like, there are various women now who are doing interesting concrete poetry and versions of it. You know, you can call it different things. On the other hand, everything that's visual poetry isn't really concrete poetry. I mean, just because you spread words on the page, you know, what some people do is not always so interesting or useful either. So there's a lot of vispo that is not necessarily, comes across my desk, that is not necessarily, it's too easy, that isn't necessarily very good. And you realize how hard it is to do well. It's very hard to do well. And the notion that anybody can do it, or that it's for children somehow or whatever, is ridiculous. But for a long time, it was never, and still, if you look at syllabi, I bet right there at the University of Massachusetts in the English department, they don't teach any, do they teach any concrete, but I doubt it. Do you know?
I wouldn't know that, but you mentioned Nancy, and actually she's coming out with a translation, right? Of Augusto de Campos. Among, I mean, there are.
Oh, it's not a translation. It's an anthology.
It's an
But she
anthology.
has on each and every, it features Augusto and Geraldo. They really more or less the featured poet. She wanted to have even more of them, but she had to be generous and have a lot of others. She's a lot of Ian Hamilton Finley. She has the Austrian poets, poets of the post-war years, a very like Günther, are very interesting, you know, and those poets of the Wiener Gruppe, and she has some Japanese poetry in it too. So it has some, which was very important. Concrete poetry was very important in Japan, and Kitao Kitasone. There's some all kinds of very interesting things. So she does have for each poem a whole paragraph explaining the poem a little bit. I mean, explicating the poem a little bit. How does it work? And so I think that's going to be a kind of first for some of those poems, but it's not a, she also did a show at the Getty. That's what got her started. And the show was called Tango with Cows. And just as a gift for my birthday, I just got this, which is Kaminsky's, you know it, I'm sure, the David Berliuk Tango with Cows, done in English by with a long commentary by Eugene Ostashevsky, who's quite a good poet and a very good translator. I am thrilled to have this. I haven't even had a chance to read it yet, but every line, every page looks exactly the same, but is in English. So here's a translation, a new attempt at translation. And he has about 100-page commentary. He hasn't found a publisher for the commentary yet, or for the whole thing. Ugly Duckling was supposed to produce this. It's done in Moscow, but I'm not sure they can, that they have the money. I think maybe they're doing it, but they're not doing the commentary. And so if you know a good press for the whole thing of the commentary, I think it's a wonderful work of a leading Russian book. That's a little different. Kaminsky was a little bit different, but that certainly is an artist book. And then, of course, we get the whole question of what's the relation of concrete poetry to artist books, which is a question I could ask you, because I'm not so sure always what that relationship really is. It's very close, but it's different again, right? I don't know what you think about that. I can't hear you.
Moira?
Do you want to comment on that, Moira? How does concrete poetry relate to the artist's book?
I can't hear you.
Yes.
You're on mute.
I'm on, I say I would have to think about that.
You do?
I would have to. think about that,
yeah.
yes.
Oh, I thought maybe you had, yeah, that's subject. Well, you know, you could say the individual pages of artist books are often like a concrete poetry, but not necessarily. And sometimes they're narratives, you know, they're whole narratives that are very different again, and that use the visual more as illustration, you know, which is a different thing again. So all these things we have to observe certain Infrathin differences because they're not the same. It's not true that the artist book is the same thing as the concrete, although you could certainly call Augusto's books, Haroldo's books, artist books.
Yes.
Yeah.
Haroldo's translation of of Genesis and Goethe.
Yes.
They're artist books.
Yes, I mean, there's certainly, I consider those artist books, or even something like the Panorama to Finnegan's Wake. The panorama, whatever it is, on Finnegan's Wake is an artist book, certainly. Like an artist book, I mean, the art really figures in it, right? So again, but they're not necessarily the same. You can have concrete poetry that would not be part of that.
Marjorie, you mentioned well, you mentioned it, when you were talking before, how the attention to difference, to the infrathin, is actually important in the age of digital reproduction. Do you want to say something more about this?
Yeah, I did say that it's especially important in the age of digital reproduction, where every letter counts. Every letter counts. When were we so aware of letters? If you put in one wrong letter when you're writing an email, it won't go through, right? A comma, if you're missing a comma, it won't go through. That makes you very much aware of, say, punctuation marks, exclamation points, commas, periods. When do you have them? When don't you? And so I think the digital in general, and the fact that you can reformat everything if you want, you could reformat to change the lineation and do different things with it. And people do that all the time. Andre Vallias is a poet who just takes many things and, it's kind of a conceptual work and changes them slightly. And therefore they change meaning completely. If you change one letter, and I notice this so much, by the way, when you dictate, when you use Siri's not so bright, and this has happened to me often. You put in the name Faulkner, it comes out as fuck you. Really, I'm not making that up. If you put in Ashbury, which I did, it once came out asshole. Now I'm not making, and they get everything wrong, and they can't do it so that you become so aware of the letters. And so you have to yourself always spell out names and titles and see what the letters are, because otherwise it'll come out completely wrong. And that's when you realize how very important lettrism, in a way, I mean, just the sheer quality. What's the difference between viva and via, with the V's, the I's, and the A's? Oh, but suppose you reverse the letters. What do you get? Sometimes you get something that's like a poem in itself, just by reversing the letters, and it might make a wonderful, slightly different poem. I've seen that. You can play with that. And so how can you not be aware of that today? So I think that's one reason. Kenneth Goldsmith, the poet, who is the proprietor of UbuWeb. UbuWeb, if you don't know it, is a wonderful website. Anybody can use it anytime, and it's privately owned. It doesn't belong to a university. He does it. It's his website, so he hasn't had to worry about all the copyrights. He has a wonderful section on concrete poetry on there. Both the Brazilian poets, but also a lot of other poets, and Mary Ellen Solt, and so on. And he has all kinds of other things, contemporary things, of course. And he wrote already years ago that that concrete poetry prefigured work with the digital, and which is what he works with. And it's interesting that not so much Haroldo, and then that Augusto in his later years taught himself to use the computer and do these things himself, taught himself how to program. I wish I knew how. I don't, but I think it's really great thing, because if you know how, then you can do all kinds of things. Now, a poet like Craig Dworkin, this is a name to watch. Craig Dworkin does things always with just reversing letters, and it's very funny often too. There was a long poem by Ron Silliman called Chanting, and it began like this: not this, what then? No, not this, what then? And there's a friend of Ron Silliman's, the poet Barrett Watton, who's always very difficult and very contrary and so forth. And he edited a magazine called This. So not this, Watton, Barrett Watton. It practically spelled out the name. And once you've seen that, you can't read those lines, not this, what then, without putting in that other reading. And it's just so funny. So often it's very funny, and sometimes it's inadvertently funny, and you get satire and pun, all kinds of things that come up. But of course, that's the beauty of poetry, that it is the language art. That I really do feel strongly. It is the language art. It differs from the novel, not that they aren't poetic novels, but I was just thinking about this because somebody sent me a reference to her new book on Virginia Woolf and poetry, where she argues that Virginia Woolf thought poetry was a masculinist art and therefore wanted to do, she kept poetic effects, but she wanted to do the novel because that was the new art form. Well, that isn't true today anymore, though, at all. The novel seems quite traditional. And so I started thinking, well, what does it mean to write a poetic novel? It means you've got lots of metaphor and you've got lots of imagery and you have passages that sound, quote, poetic, but that isn't how we use the word, at least not the way I use poetry in that way. It doesn't have to be poetic in that way. And that's one thing that Duchamp pointed out and that the Russian formalists pointed out. Poetry doesn't have to have imagery at all. It can be based on syntax like Gertrude Stein. It can be based on literal words used a certain way. So the notion of the poetic novel is one I'm a little skeptical about, or at least I don't see that it's so wonderful, or that we want the novel. But when I read a novel, I want to have a little plot, you know, I mean, you do want to, something happen. And so there's a whole topic there, what that relationship is, you see. But of course it changes because we hardly think of the novel today as something new. On the contrary, the novel seems like the one thing everybody reads. But I do think that by the way, Liz Coates also criticizes concrete poetry, says it's too much like advertising. And of course, many people have said that it's just like advertising. Well, it is true that some advertising is now very clever and uses material that does look, you know, you could say it's a little concrete poem. I don't know that that makes it bad. That takes us back to the question of lyrics and music. I mean, yes, it uses popular forms like advertising or vice versa. Advertising uses, right, forms of poetry, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing either. Can't hear you now. Your mic.
Well,
yeah.
yes, we are. I mean, we have,
Yeah.
yes, overdone the time, so we have to finish. Moira, would you like to please?
You didn't get
Yes,
your
yes.
question.
I'm sorry we didn't get to talk about Williams.
Yes,
But
you want to do that
maybe
for a minute?
for another time. I think we have to say goodbye to the audience and but perhaps just another time. Yeah.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
I brought the books the other
I
way.
know, I
Oh,
know.
wow.
I had
Right,
mine
you
here
got
too. So, well,
Yeah.
you know where to find me and I know where to find you.
Yes. Thank you very much. These were incredible questions. You know,
So well, we want to thank
you were
you very
incredible
much.
interlocutors.
So
I
much.
won't go on too long.
It's been
Thank
just
you,
a
Marjorie.
joy. Yeah, it's been wonderful. And I wish we could go on
I
and
loved
on,
it.
but
Yeah, I understand.
everybody has to get
Sorry
home
to
and
overtime.
various things
I'll
like
look at the
that.
questions. I think I have the questions right here. Yeah. Oh, but it's
Great.
going off. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll take a quick look. Do you feel we have lost the nuance of poetry? Somebody said. If so, why do you think this happened? Well, there's a question. I don't want to try to answer that now. Yeah, I'll think about them. I'll think about your questions.
So to the audience, I'd just like to remind you that our next guest will actually be our next event is on October the 28th, also at 5 p.m. Ngugi wa Thiong'o will be here talking about writing in an indigenous African language and self-translation. And we would love to see you all here again. But again, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure, such a privilege to meet you and have this wonderful, relaxed and incredibly interesting,
very
informative
lovely
conversation.
Thank you, Tal, and thank you, Raphael. Yeah, thank you all very much.
And enjoy the rest of your birthday week.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye.